Hey, so this is the Drunkalogs, a podcast about addiction and recovery in which each guest shares their version of how it was, what happened, and how it is now, and then endures a half-hour Q&A at the hands of your host, Nick Morton. My next guest grew up just outside of Manhattan, popping into the city to work in restaurants, play gigs as a drummer, and to party. He watched as his adolescent use of recreational drugs and alcohol slowly blossomed into a full-blown heroin addiction, whose maintenance consumed his every waking hour. After successfully kicking his habit, he nearly relapsed when his girlfriend died of an overdose, and was only saved by what he feels is some sort of spiritual intervention. He now lives in Oregon and is just launching his own brand of hot sauce, Joey's Hot Sauce, whose depth and roundness of flavor is really, in my experience, unprecedented. Won't you please welcome Joey Repice. I think most people who have any kind of addiction have multiple kinds of addiction because, in my own experience, the minute I stopped drinking, I had all kinds of, that energy just never goes away. It's never gone away from me. I'm a crazy person. So I think drugs are equally interesting. They're both just, ways of sort of, escaping the world, blunting the pain of existence. So yeah. All right. How do you say your name?
Joey Repice is the last name. Repice. It's
really
Italian. Yeah, it's Italian.
And
yeah.
People, regular Americans, say
nobody
Repice?
says it. Nobody says it.
How do most people say it?
Repice or Repice or
And so, if you're introducing yourself to someone, I'm like, hey, I'm Nick Morton. You're who?
Joey Repice. Nice to meet you.
Joey Repice. That's just it. That's not that difficult. Yeah. Anyway, so Joey Repice, tell us your story. How does it begin?
It begins. My parents were Southern Italians. We came here. I was born here in the States, but my parents come from Calabria, the southern part of Italy, and I was, I was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. I was raised on the East Coast. And I had two sisters. One of my sisters was born in Italy. I was born in Hoboken, like I said. And I talk about not only having, alcoholism, I have Italianism. Which, to me, it's a part of the ego, which is really laid out in the steps,
right.
Which is a part of who makes me who I am in some way, shape, or form. That's the beauty of the program, is that it right sizes me.
Right.
Those characteristics can be, things that are good qualities for a human being to have, and they can also be ways that I'm stepping on the toes of others if it's not
right. It's like a fine line between self-assertive and in other people's faces, I guess.
Yeah exactly. Yeah, so I started out I was a late bloomer. I have the first vivid memory as a child drinking alcohol was there would be, my mom had this little genie bottle, and she would put her amaretto in this little
right.
genie bottle. And I would watch her just as a kid, just kind of watching her do her thing with her friends coming over. They would have biscotti and they would make espresso and they would
right.
pour this espresso and they would pour this little genie bottle into their espresso. So I'm just observing as a child, there's something magical about this little genie bottle, right?
Right.
So when she looked away, I grabbed this little genie bottle, and she had this cute little cristalera, which is these, little crystal glasses that she had in this cabinet. And I poured myself a shot of this little, red mysterious bottle. And I remember drinking it. And I remember that warmth going down my mouth, and that sweetness. And I remember just wow, this feels amazing, And I was running around the table and I felt free and I was dancing. And then my mom, she's like, what are you doing? What is this? You son of a bitch, And
how old were you?
I don't even have a
Right.
memory of, I think it was like maybe, 7,
Right. Something like
something
that.
like that.
Right.
I was a young kid, and that was kind of the first introduction to having alcohol surging through my body. It took the edge off. What does a 7-year-old kid edge in the
Right.
world have? I don't know.
Right.
But I just do know that, I was a shy kid. I was, kind of a timid kid. I was a sensitive kid, and the sensitivity, was kind of like frowned upon by my father, and like it was embraced by my mother. So I had all this like, Italian Americanism just like running through me. Then, and as I got older, my later years of actually a conscious drink was with my friend Paulie. We were in the basement, and my mom had a stash. They didn't really drink, so every time
Right.
the holidays would come around, they would have a stash of alcohol that they would put into the cabinet, and because people would bring alcohol over for the holidays, and be like, oh, thank you, Johnny Walker Black, Johnny Walker Red, Crown Royal, Grand Marnier, all this stuff that would just wind up landing in the pantry. And I didn't know, atoms from apples. So I just went, and my friend Paulie said, "Al, grab one of those bottles, from the cabinet." And I was like, all right. So I just grabbed the bottle and I brought it downstairs, and, Paulie, like, I think, rolled the joint, and, we smoked the joint, and we drank. The first like conscious drink was Drambuie, of all things, and those who don't know, Drambuie is like a Scotch liqueur, like sweet Scotch, and I just remember that, just me and Paulie having the best of the times,
How old were you
laughing.
guys?
17,
Right. Right.
17, 17 years old, smoking cigarettes, trying a little weed, and drinking Drambuie in the basement.
Drambuie, that's amazing. My dad used to drink Drambuie every now and then, and every now when I got a little bit older, I would sometimes have one with him. But it was not like I loved it. That Dad loved it. Like there was I loved the sound of the name, like Drambuie. We're gonna have a Drambuie. Like it's so absurd, and yet I don't remember. I barely remember the taste, but kind of cough syrupy would be like
totally.
recollection.
Like a lot of those liquors, as art, the art of drinking whiskey and stuff like that wasn't necessarily like evolved in the hipster kind of era,
Right.
which is like I'm 50, so like all the stuff that was available to us was either like Johnny Walker Red, like that was like, wow.
Right.
Johnny Walker
Sure.
Black was like, ooh, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
And but Drambuie was, the other stuff like Southern Comfort. Those were the kind of sweet, hard stuff, and that's what Drambuie was. It was like sweet, hard stuff, and there was no problems like for throughout my high school years, early stages, there was no problems, but there were telltale signs that I was an alcoholic.
Right.
It's in my bloodline. I hear stories later on about my father's dad, my grandfather, and how, he would like drink pretty profusely, make his own moonshine in the Italian, basically, creating his own like grappa in the Italian mountains. And he was very abusive, and he actually drank himself to death in the in the mountains. Wow. All by himself.
Sure.
And he was pretty young. I never got to meet the guy, but they were seeing characteristics in me, and they were like, maybe you're just like grandpa, and I'm like, don't worry about it. And,
like, what was some of the shit that you were doing at that age that people were like, oh, this doesn't end well?
I would host parties. I would host parties in my basement. Basement was kind of like my haven. I would like early on, I would like listen to music. As a kid, I would play like race cars. I had like this little area in the basement, and then as I got older, I'd play music and escaping music, and then it was the music and like the drinking, and then I would host these parties with friends coming over, and the amount of booze we would go through would be pretty insane, and the fact that I would just like like drink myself to the point where it was like oblivion in a sense.
Yeah.
I got pretty lit early stages, and
Yeah.
I would be hosting these parties and I'd be passed out on, like, and friends would like, write stuff on you back in those
Right.
days. And,
Sure.
no one really documented it like, a teenager has to go
Right.
through
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
today with like videography,
Sure.
but nevertheless, there would be maybe a picture. I don't think it was a picture of me floating around that I know of, like all like, writing silly stuff on people's face with a marker but I would wake up. And I remember one time, like someone was like waking me up, and my mom stashed these like, this like gift. It was like a Jesus light. And it was almost this like, these lights that would almost be like, I don't know how to describe them. Back in those days, they would be the 70s lights where there was these backlights, and then it was like this illuminating like light of Jesus kind of praying. And and I remember waking up and and my friends kind of propped it, turned it on, and put it in front of me. And it was just like this memory of just coming out of this fog and seeing Jesus.
Seeing Jesus waiting for you, right? Waiting for you to be saved.
Yes. Didn't get the sign back then, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, that was a telltale sign. Also, me drinking to the point I would go out with my friend Rob. Rob was a drinking partner of mine,
right.
And we would go out into New York because living in Jersey, living right on the coastal lines of New Jersey, and New York was like just a hard hop, skip, and a jump away. So we would basically, get on the bus, pay $1 to get through the Lincoln Tunnel, and we'd wind up in the city, and we brought a big bottle of like tequila or whiskey or whatever it was, and then we drink it and decide we're going downtown, and we're just like walking down. By the time we got to our destination,
so
Rob and I were just like done, and
that sounds awesome.
Yeah, until like vomiting started to come into the picture, and
right.
And then I would remember getting home and just passing out, and then I had these memories of just like, wow, this is a waterfall. I'm standing in front of a waterfall, and then I was like, oh, let me piss in front of the waterfall,
right?
And I would be pissing in my bed.
Right,
I'd wake up the next morning. I was so hammered that that would happen. I would like sleepwalk, and my poor mom had to deal with me. I remember opening up the door to the stairwell, because we lived on the first floor of a 2-apartment complex, and I remember opening up the door and like thinking this was the bathroom, and like pissing down the steps. Those were just common things that I would pee in the like garbage can. Like I would just do these things, that were telltale signs, like
right.
And things kind of just felt somewhat manageable through high school. And then I started like experimenting with like mescaline. In the city that I lived in, it was, kind of very densely populated, and there was some, Italians, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and it's like a multicultural like area, which in some ways are great, but in other ways, like, there was a lot of drugs on the street.
What did your parents do? What kind of work did they do?
My dad was a tailor. He was a custom made tailor. So he had his own little shop.
How cool.
And he would like just sit there. I remember, going into the shop, and he would be like stitching away,
right.
And like all hand stitching and machine stitch and hand stitch. He would custom make suits for lawyers in the neighborhood.
Right.
So yeah, I would start experimenting with mind altering substances. There was kind of like mescaline was one of the first things that I kind of got introduced to.
Mescaline is such an unlikely first hallucinogen, I gotta say. Like,
and it was like a street
especially
version.
For Hoboken. Like, it's one thing you're like in Taos or something, you're in the whatever, but
it was a street version. I don't think it was like anything compared to like the actual mezcal, because it's supposed to come from the mezcal. like
Right, like the
cactus.
Anasazi Indians
Yeah,
harvesting it off the
I think
cactus, right?
this was like a synthetic form on the
Right.
streets. The purple double barrels. And just to be clear, I was born in Hoboken, but I was raised in a town that was called West New York, New Jersey, and I was explaining that one for the rest of my life.
That's
Where do you live? In
hilarious.
New Jersey. Where? In West New York. I thought you said you lived in New Jersey. It's like
It's West New York, New Jersey.
it's west of New York. It's in New Jersey.
I
On
mean,
the
talk
shore.
about a town with like low self-esteem.
Tell me about it. Its sheer existence is the existence of its bigger New York. It's the
Right.
west of New York, So yeah, I started messing around, and I was into like the Doors, and I thought,
Right.
I was really thinking like this is the stuff that's going to open my mind, and on some level, hallucinogens do, like, that's the thing about alcohol and drugs, like they do open some portholes into the our existence and our perception of the world. It does open us up.
How
But
was
there's a
that first
price to pay.
mescaline trip?
It was just a lot of laughter,
Right.
and a lot of running around in the town, and
Right.
just like, a lot of like creativity, and I just remember tons of laughter. What we
Right.
were laughing about, no clue, but it was
Right.
it was just a lot of fun. We were just
That's
laughing
cool.
at
Right.
the top of our lungs, and then there were a couple trips that were pretty weird,
On
and
mescaline as well? Was that
yeah,
your that was your
yeah,
sort of early drug of
yeah.
choice? Wow.
Yeah, it was because I had a friend of mine that turned me on to a spot that if you bought 100 of them, you'd pay 50 cents each,
Right. Wow, that's pretty cheap.
So you'd have this like stash of mescaline,
Right.
sell them to your
It's like
friends
a
for,
lifetime supply.
not for not for me. Yeah, that was definitely a host of problems that started like sneaking in. I never forget the day, where I used to have this long, before there were cordless lines, I used to have this really long cord line
Sure.
that would like extend all the way into the basement,
Sure.
right? And I'd be hanging out listening to music, and I was like on the phone, I think with either a friend or a girl, and I was trip was starting to kick in, and then all of a sudden my dad picks up the phone and he's like, Joe, come up the stairs now. I was like, whoa. Talk about a head kill.
Right.
My dad had this like stern presence. And I think I stole like, some money from his pocket or something like that. And then, he was just like having this conversation with me, and I was in complete denial. And it was just like this stern conversation. And he's like, what's the matter with you? And I was like, what? Nothing, trying to keep it like together. And I'm just like tripping. And
meanwhile, he's turning into a
tough.
Tweety bird, like right in front of you.
Yeah, it didn't get that. It wasn't that hallucinogenic, but there were some like color, like trails. There were a couple trails that were going on, and
so, did you graduate high school?
No, that's another thing too. Like, I remember, I went and I was hanging out with a friend who was a girl. Wasn't an actual girlfriend, but it was a friend who was a girl, and we were. Took our lunch, and we went and we smoked, a little bit of weed right before we went to class. And I came back from lunch, and it was running a little bit late. And I walked into the classroom, and it felt like it was in slow motion. And I saw the looks on the students' face, like, don't go in. And I didn't really put that together. So I came in the door, and it was the principal looking over, and he said, he goes, oh, Joseph, we've been waiting for you, and I was like, oh gosh, and he takes me into the office, and, like I said, I was like selling a couple of those like, narcotics to like friends at like, peanuts. I was just selling them like for like, kind of just not really like, but that's technically being a drug dealer,
Sure.
And I think what happened is like it got a hold of one kid, and he didn't have such a great experience. And then somehow it got back to the principal, and and somehow I'm in front of the principal's desk, and he's it wasn't good. It wasn't pretty. And I felt so embarrassed. I like went into my locker room, and I felt so embarrassed. And and I said to my dad, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit high school. And he was just like, not coming from the school of like any school. He was just like, he thought, you be who you are, and that really doesn't mean anything. Just
Right.
you can just make something of yourself in this
Sure.
country,
Right.
without,
Sure.
so I basically didn't graduate high school.
And
I
was that
was
like senior year that you quit?
it was. How did you guess that?
I don't know. It just felt that way to me. And also because like you didn't start drinking till you were like 17. So, if you're doing like, you couldn't have been doing mescaline for that long before, like, and were you like a pretty good student? I mean, did you see yourself
No.
as like, no?
No, I wasn't. You see, there's a funny thing too with my story. There's what has been revealed to me is like I have, dyslexia,
Right.
and I was a, kind of it wasn't detected,
Right.
and I was one of those kids that would be like, okay, we're all reading one paragraph. So I would like count the amount of students to the amount what paragraph I'm supposed to read out loud, because me reading out loud was the most difficult thing for me to
Right.
do,
Sure.
So I just felt like there was like a form, of stupidity. I didn't think
Right.
that I had a learning disorder, so I would hide it. So I basically went through all of grammar school and high school without really my dyslexia being, recognized. And
Wow.
in a sense, I was through charm and connection to like, I have this like gift of like connection with people,
Right.
which is like one of my superpowers. But that was what essentially got me like passing grades, making
Wow.
a
That's amazing.
relationship with these like
Right.
teachers, like, because I would just barely pass. And I actually even remember one time I studied on a test like high on pot, and that was like the best scores I ever made. I think it probably just calmed my brain
Right.
down,
Enough that you could
to the
somehow
point somehow
breathe.
focused, and
Wow.
so yeah, I dropped out of high school, and I went like right into the work arena, and I started working I was working early on, and some messed up things happened to me too in the work field. I was working at a video shop, and the guy who owned the video shop was like a married man, and he kind of took, he didn't kind of, he took advantage, and there was some messed up things that had happened to me, at that
Like
video shop.
sexual shit.
Yeah, some
Right.
sexual shit, and not so much, penetration, but there were some messed up things that had happened to me, and that kind of like played into my, those things don't necessarily like make you an alcoholic, but they definitely put some like fire, coals onto the fire to kind of like, fuel. In my experience, it fueled my alcoholism.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I honestly don't have any sort of experience with it, but like in the conversations I've had about like inappropriate sexual stuff, is there's this like this sense that like, that, that it's somehow your fault, and that
Yes,
like you should be ashamed, you have to be
absolutely,
ashamed for it. And
absolutely,
and that's like a lot to have to sort of like carry around and feel like you're
absolutely.
responsible for. So
Yeah, and then couldn't talk about it to my father. Couldn't talk about it to my mom. I
right.
didn't. I kept that inside. I kept that
Sure.
experience inside. In fact, the day that I left that job, I was riding bike on the way home, and I was in my head just like, there's screaming, so much noise, and I was riding really fast, and I was coming around a bend, and some guy whipped his door open, and I went smashing into
Oh
that door,
fuck.
and like flipped around, it landed on my head, was knocked out unconscious, and broke my arm.
Were you
You
wearing a
know,
helmet?
no,
Oh God.
back in those days,
Yeah, yeah.
helmets. Who the hell wore helmets back in those days? So yeah, those are, there's ties to like, being emotionally scarred,
Right.
having these, not having the coping mechanisms to look at, not having the network of people to help me,
Sure.
navigate those situations
Right.
in my life in a constructive way,
Sure.
So I look to escape, and, tapping into, cocaine was another thing that like was really big part of my story as
When did
well.
you find cocaine?
It was in senior year too.
Right.
Yeah, it was in that senior year as well. And, that was like I said, I started late, and compared to my neighborhood to some
Right.
extent. But I like put the pedal to the metal,
Right. Made up for
and
lost time.
I guess. So yeah, cocaine was like, like they say,
So
it's a powerful drug.
yeah, I mean, God, I mean, talk about insidious. It seems
Mm,
so harmless until like you haven't left your room for 3 days.
yeah.
So you don't graduate, you work in a video shop, and then sort of what's your sort of plan? What are you trying to do?
I decided that told my dad, hey, I want to become a bartender. Can you pay for a bartending school?
Right.
And he's like, yeah, sure. So I went to bartending school, and an alcoholic, it's like a monkey at a banana factory, and it's a monkey working at a banana factory. And there I was off to the races, and I would basically like experiment with like all the mixed cocktails that I excelled in that class. I
Right.
did a really good job over there. And
I never went. I had a moment where I was like, I should go to bartending school, and just like, because I was moving to LA, and I was like, well, that's something I can do to like make a living. But I was such like a scrawny, like prepubescent kid, like well into my 30s, that I was like, no one's gonna hire me to be a bartender. Like, it didn't seem credible. But like, would everyone be shit faced by the time class was over? Like,
oh no, bartending school was just really, it was food coloring inside the bottles.
right?
You know
Oh,
what I mean?
interesting. Right.
So, when I say what I would experiment with all the things, it's because after,
Right.
like, class adjourned, it's like, let's go try this one,
Right.
this one, and this one,
Right. Right.
and I would buy the ingredients and like mix, become this
Right.
mixologist, and wanted to know what, like at least half of my drinks were going to
Sure.
taste like,
Yeah.
and I would do that, and and wind up like drinking and going into the city and partying, and and when landing up in strange situations, strange people's houses, and in the city's like such a crazy place. I remember just walking down, like an avenue, and just like screaming at people, and just wind up hanging out with people, complete strangers, drinking with people, winding up at strange women houses, and it was just like a common way of like it happened to, like just every time I went out to drink in New York, it was just,
Yeah, you just never know where it's gonna end up. It
yeah,
always ends up in some weird thing, and you're like, it's 4 a.m. How? What am I doing here?
strange ceiling syndrome is what they called it.
That's funny. So
Yeah.
but so do you become a bartender?
Yes,
Right.
I was a bartender, and I started working at a club called Love Sexy. I
Uh-huh.
worked over there, and that was in Hoboken. I started working in restaurants in New York City,
Right.
and I did a little bit of a nightclub thing too here and there. And I got my skills. I passed really good in my class. I was really attentive, and it was really, I was focused, and having to develop that skill. Granted, this wasn't, nowadays there's a whole different level of
Sure.
bartending.
Yeah.
It's like a completely different mindset.
Right.
Back in those days, it was just, everything was just, you know um everything came from concentrate. Nobody was using fresh lemon juice. It was
Right.
rare. It was like the
Right.
bartending and the mixology was a different science, different
Sure.
art form back in those days. And um, I started getting into more restaurants and started training into like wines, and I worked at a pretty cool like mom and pop restaurant kind of vibe, and there were a cute couple that they took me in, and I started out there, and I started working and having more hours and giving more accountability, more responsibility. And, then what really accelerated my bottom was the introduction of heroin. Heroin came
Right.
into my life, and that was wild. I missed out a big part of like who I was growing up, and that's being a musician. I didn't
Right.
even tap into any of this, and that was a big part of
What
who
was
I
your instrument?
identified myself. I was a drummer,
Right.
big time drummer. I remember first it was early stages of me playing, getting these sticks when I worked at like Sam Goody. They had an accessory wall, and I would get these drumsticks, and I would listen to music, and we would be listening to John Bottom, and I would hit this like vinyl chair that was in our basement, and my friend Michael turned to me and he's like, "Man, you should be a drummer."
Right.
And it was like, "Oh yeah, you think so?" And it's like, "Yeah, you should totally be a drummer." So from that from that like accident that I had when I was a kid, we had a court case that the settlement, the money that came into the bank, I ended up buying my first drum set off of that money. And
The accident you had when you were a kid, was that going over the door?
yeah,
Right.
going over the door, and the guy opened up his car door, so
Right.
he didn't really have like great insurance, but I got a little bit of a court settlement
Right.
out of that, and I bought my first drum set, and I was playing, and me and my buddies, we were starting a couple different bands, and it was a perfect relationship, drinking and playing music, and just there's a lot of noise in every artist's head, I feel.
Sure.
And the way to quiet that noise down is definitely, for me, like using mind altering substances were a way to kind of just quiet and just like get into the moment, in a sense.
Sure. Yeah. Totally.
But again, there's always this price to pay when you take a shortcut. I really couldn't even like perform right if I didn't have any of those things like kind of
Sure.
surging through my body. And then I couldn't even perform right. I couldn't even like have these things surging through my body anymore. It was just like they weren't working.
Right.
I was trying to like tap into that place, and it wasn't working. And then it was like a full-time job, trying to get some like mind altering substances, and then it consumed my life to the point where I wasn't even practicing and playing shows anymore. I was
Right.
too busy chasing after how am I going to get my next fix.
So at what point did that become all about heroin?
Yeah, the funny thing about heroin is like, the first time I was supposed to do it, I gave money to our friend, and we were going to meet up at the house later, and I was hanging out with the girl, and I came back home. I rode my bike home, and for some reason I forgot my keys in the house, and I was knocking on the door, and I saw that there was movement back there, and I was like knocking on the door, and no one was coming to the door. I was like, what the hell's going on, guys? I started pounding on it even louder, and then my buddy Rich comes up, and he's like white, he's like,
Right.
man, I don't know what the hell, and Claudie, and we were scared, and we're like, oh no, what's going on? And our friend wasn't responding, wasn't waking up.
Wow.
We pulled him into the bathtub, we're running water on him, and we didn't even have cell phones. We didn't even have a
Had he
house
shot
phone.
up, or had he just been snorting it?
Just snorting it,
Right.
snorting it.
Wow.
And I think he had been drinking a lot
Right.
that particular day. So we ran to the corner and called the police, and the police came, and they revived him, thank God. But that was the first day. It's like, telltale sign,
Like, don't go down this
the
road.
divine is like
Yeah.
sitting there like, don't go down this road. Did I listen? I just kept going down that road. And, the first time I ever did it, I remember that feeling. That feeling was just like, it was like this veil came over of just like this comfort, this almost like womb-like existence, where just like this, everything is just perfect in its existence, just the way it is right now. And I didn't really experience that in life, and I had
Right.
tastes and glimpses of that. But the
Sure.
first time I ever did heroin, it was just like such a minuscule amount. And I was just like, oh, that little thing right there. And it's, yeah. And I had no idea what I was opening
Right.
the door to into my life, that like that song Guns N' Roses. I used to do a little, but the little wouldn't do. So the little got more and more. And I just
Right.
keep trying to get a little better instead of a little better than before.
Right.
And then your tolerance, with that substance is like, it just snowballs.
Right.
It's a devil, it's like the devil's dandruff is another way of it. It was put to me, and
Sure.
I agree with that a zillion percent. I had no idea like that, how dark my life, was going to go, and how like just consumed by this substance, my life had become.
So once you're in the throes of like real heroin addiction, what's your life like?
Oh, it's isolated, it is dark.
Are you
You're basic,
still able to hold down a job?
for a while, I held down a couple jobs here and there in the construction field. For a little while in the beginning, I was running. I'm laughing because an alcoholic running a liquor store. I was running a liquor store for a while, and that was like a hot spot, and it was like cash on hand. But that was when I was dabbling into it, and then I isolated myself from my family. So I had some construction jobs that didn't really care how you showed up to work,
Right.
as long as you showed up and did what needed to get done.
But
And
you kind of washed out of the restaurant business because that
yeah,
required too much. You got to be present. You got to have your shit together.
yeah,
Right.
it did.
Yeah.
And then I started getting, and then the girlfriend that I was dating at the time was a dancer,
Right.
so then my full-time job, when we lived together, was driving her to the club,
Right.
catching her at mid shift, getting some money from her, going to score, coming back and picking her up at the end of the shift, and having stuff for her and us
So,
basically on repeat. Like,
so
you know,
she
we,
was a heroin addict too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So like that was like my full-time job, was
Right.
just
Keeping you
supplying
guys.
her.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like getting busted in the city. I remember her, she was just didn't know what happened to me. She thought I like, died, and I was just, I got nailed, like
Yeah. Right.
purchasing in New York, and they were doing one of those when Giuliani was started doing all those
Right.
raids in New York and started changing the landscape of New York City. And so yeah, I got some crazy stories of when I used to score in the city. I don't know if you want to hear any of that.
I mean, I'm always interested in a crazy story. Definitely.
Sure. There was this one day that I went in, and I was basically going to score and cop and there were certain parts of the city where they would have you know like certain spots that you would go to, and it was kind of dry at that stage, and I was looking and going to certain spots, and this one guy kind of just made eye contact, and he's like, oh, I know this spot, let me take you to it. And I got into an elevator, we went into a project, so we went up to a floor, and we got in front of the door, and he's like, okay, I'm just going to knock on the door, just give me the money now, and we're going to go in, but I need to be the one that gives him the
Right.
money. And I had my spidey sense, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't
You're
listen.
too desperate.
Yeah, I gave him the money, and then he took a dash. He ran, and I ran after him, and I had these like slippery like boots on, and kind of like fashionista boots, like these like rock and roll boots that didn't have like a sole, and I'm like slipping and running after this guy, and he's running up to the top of the projects, and he gets onto the roof, and then he jumps from one roof to the next, and I'm like
Oh my
jump
God.
I'm going after this
Right.
guy, he's like going after him for my life, but he's like gaining like lots of ground on me,
Right.
and he goes down. After he jumps onto the next one and goes all the way down, and then he goes into the playground, and I'm like not too far behind him, but I was far enough behind, and he hops over a fence. And by the time I get over the fence, I was just like,
You're done.
defeated.
Yeah.
I was done. And then this one guy comes up to me and he's like, "Oh, what happened?" I'm like, he got me for the money. He goes, "Well," he goes, "if you know a spot, I can give you, I'll give you a bag to set you straight." and what do I do with this poor guy that's like trying to help me? I bring him to a spot. I get his money. And I jump out the freaking window after I scored.
Oh my God.
And like went down this alley because I have to go bring it back to my
of course, you got your
girlfriend,
girlfriend who's
and
like paying the rent.
She's like hurting,
right.
And so it's just like, here I am. This happens to me, and I take it from Peter, give it to Paul, give it from Paul, and give it to Peter. It was just a low moment in my life.
Hilarious.
Like, what the hell?
We made this movie a couple of years ago called 1,000 Junkies, which is basically just about like 3 dudes, middle-aged guys, heroin addicts, and you start off in like a flophouse motel, and they're all like dope sick, and they need to score, but they've burnt every bridge. There is no one left who will front them or like sell to them or loan them money or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And you follow them just in the course of a day as they get more and more sick. And it's really like what you were saying, where like, that's their job. Like, that's all they do. Like, because that is what, like, that's what they need to do. They just like spend all day trying to get high. And then finally at the end of our movie, they get high, and that's the end of it. But, and, it's kind of a sad, dark story, but it's also funny too, because there's like all kinds of like stupid hijinks like that, where like, they're just like trying to fuck everyone over, but they always get fucked over. And it's pretty funny.
It's funny because I took pride of like, friendships that I was developing. I felt close to friends, and and I basically sold a guitar and an amp that was a friend of mine.
Right.
And we brought him to the store when I was doing my amends one time, and I said, go ahead, man, pick what you want on that wall, and that was part of me making the amends to him, was just buying him a guitar.
Sure.
And so it took me to some like places, like lines that I thought I would never cross. Just started becoming inevitable. I just started going to darker and darker places, and places that I couldn't even like look at myself in the mirror anymore.
Sure.
I just really felt like so low. I stole from my mother, I stole from my dad finances, and it's just like I never thought I would do things. I am like generally a really honest person when I'm not like messed up with mind altering substances, but that's what it does to me. It hardwires me to just, my code of ethics just get skewed, and all bets are off. I have 16 years of continuous sobriety today.
Right.
And my life's completely different. My wife never met that guy, thank God.
So what happens? Like what finally, what brings you to your knees, I guess?
That relationship went on for many years with that one girl, and she was my running buddy, and then we had like complications in our relationship, as you can just imagine.
2 heroin addicts, one's a dancer, one's unemployed. How could this not end? How could this not end well? Like, why there's no happy ending here? I don't believe it.
And jealous Italian, like this, and all this stuff that would go on in my head. And God knows what, like she's like dancing, she's got to support her habit. There's, God knows, some of that real or fancied, who knows what had happened. But we split up, and first we got back together, and I did a geographical, we moved to Florida. That was where she was from. So, we went to get clean and start our lives over. And she decided to try to help a friend that, she cheated on me with. It was a bandmate. And, I said, hey, if you go try to help him, we're finished. And she went anyway. So she went back to New York. while I was staying with her parents in
Wow.
Florida. And I was just trying to like, get myself together and, turn my back on like, heroin. I didn't
Right.
want to, it was like, it was ugly at that stage. It wasn't fun anymore. It was
Yeah.
all, it was all dark and lonely. And
And are you like detoxing down there?
yeah, we
Right.
detoxed. We went through the worst part of it together,
Right.
and then she decides to go try to help him detox.
Right.
And she goes up north, and she winds up back,
Sure.
in Florida, and like, all messed up all over again. But we had broken up, and we started a band in Florida, and next thing you know, she is in trouble in Florida as well. And I told myself I wasn't, in the trouble, because I wasn't doing heroin at the time, but I was like rolling on ecstasy on weekends. I was
Right.
drinking, and I
Right.
was doing
Wow.
all this, as
Right.
party and shenanigans. And granted, I didn't do heroin for that short period of time that I lived in Florida, but I wind up like leaving Florida. I'm like, oh, you're in the hospital. She had endocarditis from like, shooting up, heroin into her veins, that it created this like block around her valves, and they had to intravenously give her antibiotics, and so it was just
Right.
like, and she's in denial about, I didn't use anything. I'm like,
Dude.
that's it. I'm not going to be in a band with you anymore. I'm leaving, Florida. I'm going back home.
Right.
So I went back to New York, and well, not New York. I was living in Jersey, and I went back into the restaurant industry. I went back as a bartender, and I was really starting to get myself, kind of back on track in life. Still managing to drink and not use heroin, but I was like on the phone with her, telling her like how life is too difficult, and like, and she's like, oh, we're going to start a band again. Me and Johnny are going to move back up. And I started dabbling around with heroin again, but this
Right.
time all by myself. Didn't have nobody to blame. And she was going to come back up. We were going to start a new band, and I went to my friend's house to clean up by myself. And then something told me to give her a call, and I picked up the phone, and her boyfriend picked up the phone, and he's like, she's gone. And I was like, what do you mean, Johnny? What? He's like, she's gone. Nicole's gone. And she overdosed that night.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was a real turning point for me, because it made things extremely black and white. It said to me, every characteristic that I hated in her, I started seeing in myself.
Right.
And it just, there was a pattern there, that if I continued living how I was living, this is what was going to happen to me. And I went, and my initial reaction was to actually go score. I couldn't deal with the pain.
Sure.
And I went, and I was in like my bedroom, and people say this is like, probably in your head, but I felt her presence
Right.
in that came into the room, and it felt real to me. It's just as real as this conversation that we're having. And I felt her angry presence, like, this stuff just killed me, and what are you doing?
Right.
That was kind of like, in essence, what I was feeling from her presence in the room. And I acknowledged that. And at that time, there wasn't 9/11 or anything. It was pre 9/11. So I got like, there was relapse in my story, just in case you're wondering.
Right.
So I got myself like some methadone from the street, and brought it with me on the plane, and wanted to pay my last respects to her.
Right.
And I did. And I came back, and I surrendered to the program. I had some angels in my life, like plant seeds of recovery. And I started going into like midnight meetings on St. Mark's, and, midnight meetings on 46th Street Clubhouse. And I was just, chasing my recovery like my life depended on it, because it did.
Right.
And I, was getting 90 meetings in 90 days. And my life just started to transform, and I was starting to see like a therapist about all the trauma that I had, as a child, with those sexual stories. And, and I started getting into the program, and my life started getting better. But I think I read one pamphlet that said, maybe the artist shouldn't go to as many meetings, and I took that and ran with it,
Right.
and and I started straying from the program, and I ended up drinking again. Right. Luckily enough, it didn't go down the road of excessive anything. It was kind of just a miserable moment. It was like a 3-month run, and I was just like really miserable. And I went back into the program, and I haven't turned back since 16 years later.
Right. Wow. That's amazing. That's wild. And how do you end up in LA?
Well, LA, I was running a restaurant for a while. I was just like a bartender. First started in as a waiter. I started getting into like more healthier lifestyles, looking for restaurants that were more like in alignment with my lifestyle. And the restaurant was called Pure Food and Wine, and it was kind of vegetarian, and I was getting into cleanses. I was getting into going to the bathhouse and steaming and running and juicing and doing all this stuff that was like really good for me. But I had a 10-year run at this one particular restaurant, and the owner married a compulsive gambler. And next thing you know, our paychecks weren't coming. And next thing you know,
so
like
brutal.
Not paying purveyors. And next thing you know, this like multi-million-dollar business just
that's amazing.
Incinerated, and then it was just like, oh gosh, what am I going to do? It was in the middle of winter. I think it was just right after. It was the worst time to look for a job. It was like right after the holidays, and it was just like I was on the grind. And then some opportunity for some consultant work happened in LA, and I was like, oh, let me just explore this. And I spoke to the person who ran that restaurant. It was very similar stylistically to the restaurant I just came from. So I, just went to LA, and I did this consultant work, and it was like, oh, wow, this is winter. I was in the middle of winter in LA, and I was like downtown. I'm like, I'm like swimming in a pool complex that they were holding me up at this like house that was really nice. And I'm like, wow, this is really I can get used to this, and my wife and I decided let's give LA a go.
How'd you meet your wife?
First as a client, and then I got reintroduced to her when I was organizing an event for like music, and the owner of the space, I asked him, I said, can we get a little bit of a social push on this? And he said, oh, why don't you talk to Lisa and see, and I was like, oh, I think I know that name. And sure enough, I asked her on, like a date, and we started dating, and our first date was like a real magical night. We had great dinner. We went to a concert. We saw Jane's Addiction, and it was outdoors in Williamsburg, and so it was like we had a great time. I never felt so natural around a person in my whole life.
That's cool.
Our first date, it was just like there was a quietness about it. I think there was a lot that was resolved in me, and there's a lot of recovery in her, and we got to connect on this level that I never really connected with anyone. And we're married now. Going on like 5 years.
Nice. And what are you doing in LA? Are you doing restaurant stuff still out here?
Actually, I was in the restaurant industry in LA, and I was there at this one hot spot in Venice, and I started actually making this hot sauce, completely out of service. I went to my wife, and I was like, she was looking at a bottle of hot sauce that was on the shelf, and it's like, why do they got to put sugar in everything?
Right.
Well, what the hell is xanthan gum? And I was inspired to make her a sauce, and she just was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And I was like, oh, awesome. I'm so glad you like it. I was telling a friend at work, and the bartender's like, well, I want one. I said, well, $10. And it lit that light bulb in my head. And I started like posting on social, hey, I'm about to make a batch of hot sauce. who wants in, right?
Right.
And the next thing you know, we did a crowdfunding, and I don't live in LA. Long
Oh, you
story
don't?
short, we just moved to Oregon a year now.
Oh, no
We
way.
launched our hot sauce brand out here, and it started as service, and I continue to focus on how, wanting to put a product of quality out there. And if I knew everything that I had to do before going into it, rather than just,
Right.
applying what I know through the program, which is just the next right indicated
Right.
action, and just follow the trail of miracles. It's pretty incredible what is unfolding for us with this new venture. And I couldn't have gotten out of the restaurant industry at a better time, because
It's a
as
shit
you
show.
see, my industry got annihilated during COVID. And this was right before, it was literally right before we moved.
What's the hot sauce called?
Joey's hot sauce.
Joey's hot sauce. Pretty simple. And so, and you launched that right before COVID started? Right before the pandemic?
No, it was actually after. Yeah.
Right.
I was getting my certifications and meeting up with inspectors during the lockdown, the initial lockdowns.
Right.
And, we still launched the brand, and, we still we're in a bunch of stores here in Southern Oregon. And we just got into Erewhon, which is a really big deal for us.
Yeah, sure.
Erewhon,
is Erewhon everywhere, or is it? I mean, it's a big.
They
deal
have
now.
6 stores now, and
6 stores.
there's a lot of talk of them expanding a lot further as well. So I got in with them, at the right time.
Are all the stores in LA, or are they?
Yeah, I think they are. I
Nice.
think they are at this stage of the game.
And so, I mean, did you move to Oregon before the pandemic?
Yeah.
So that was already in the works, and then
we were going to launch it up here regardless.
Right.
Overhead costs, labor, so many factors, just how a lot easier it is.
Do you manufacture it up there?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I have a commercial kitchen out here. We produce about 640 bottles a week.
Wow.
It's all organic. It's no additives, no preservatives, no binders, no sugar. It's a pretty high quality product.
That's amazing. And can you find it online?
Yeah, you can totally find it online. You could buy directly through our website at joeyshotsauce.com, or you could get it at all these stores in Southern Oregon, and now you can find them in every Erewhon right now. We're in all 6 stores.
joeyshotsauce.com. All right, I'm gonna check it out. My son's a big hot sauce aficionado, so we'll have to get some around here and see what he has to say about it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's more of a pepper forward. It's not really vinegar, not watered down.
That's good.
It's thicker by design, and it's got a blend between hot and sweet peppers.
Wow.
If he's really into the crazy hot sauces, I don't think I'm your guy, even though I offer 3 levels of heat.
Right. He's 12, so
oh, okay. Yeah, he'll probably love it.
And are you still making music?
I'm going to actually be in LA next month, and I'm going to record with a couple friends. Music is going to always be a part of my life. I play some hand drums. I've done some percussive stuff with meditation centers. I've done rock and roll pretty much my whole life. I got introduced to world music, embraced that. I'm not as feverish and as I got to make it kind of mindset anymore. I'm more quiet about I just enjoy playing when I'm able to play. Music will always be a part. Playing drums will always be a part of who I am, but I'm not practicing and playing as feverish as I used to back in the day.
Awesome. Well, Joey, thanks for coming on here and telling the story. It's great to have you. It's
a pleasure. Thanks for letting me share. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. I hope that this can be of some service to someone out there, can connect to some part of my story, and inspire them to maybe look into their own journey of recovery. There's so much to offer. Recovery has so much to offer everyone, no matter who they are in their life and where they are.
Thanks for listening. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/thedrunkalogs.